20 million barrels of oil flow through one narrow strip of water every single day. And if someone shut it off tomorrow, your gas prices, your groceries, your heating bill, your retirement portfolio, all of it would start unraveling within hours. The strip of water is 29 nautical miles wide. That's it. 54 kilometers of ocean sitting between the global economy and a full-blown recession. It's called the Strait of Hormuz, and the country with its finger hovering over the off switch, Iran. Now here's the part that should genuinely terrify you. The world knows this. Governments know this. Energy agencies know this. Military strategists have wargamed this scenario 1,000 times. And yet, 20% of all the petroleum the world consumes still squeezes through this one bottleneck every day. Because apparently nobody thought maybe we should have a plan B. Oh wait, we do have a plan B. It covers about 13% of the flow. Maybe. Welcome to the dumbest vulnerability in the global economy. Let me paint this picture for you. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran and Oman, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and out to the Arabian Sea. Inside those 29 nautical miles, there are 2 shipping lanes, each one just 2 miles wide, with a 2-mile buffer zone between them. That's your global energy highway. 4 miles of usable water in each direction. That's what stands between you and affordable gasoline. The U.S. Energy Information Administration, the EIA, tracks what flows through this thing, and in 2024, it averaged 20 million barrels per day. The International Energy Agency puts the 2025 number at roughly the same, about 20 million barrels per day of crude oil and oil products. That's approximately 25% of all seaborne oil trade on Earth. And it's not just oil. About 1/5 of the world's entire liquefied natural gas trade, LNG, transited the Strait of Hormuz in 2024, mostly from Qatar. So if you close this strait, you're not just choking oil, you're strangling the gas supply too. The IEA specifically warns that a closure would strand LNG exports from Qatar and the UAE and trigger a supply shock in global gas markets, especially in Asia, where LNG delivered through the strait accounts for roughly 27% of the continent's total LNG imports. Compare that to about 7% for Europe. Asia doesn't just feel this, Asia gets suffocated by it. So who's shipping all this oil through? Let me break it down. The IEA's 2025 estimates give us a country-by-country look at what's transiting the strait. Saudi Arabia, 6.23 million barrels per day. Iraq, 3.63. UAE, 3.24. Kuwait, 2.37. Qatar, 1.43. Bahrain, 0.21. And Iran itself ships through its own choke point. The EIA's tanker tracking data confirms Saudi Arabia is the biggest single mover, accounting for 38% of all crude and condensate flows through Hormuz, 5.5 million barrels per day in 2024. So here's your setup. The world's most important energy corridor, controlled, in the loosest, scariest sense of that word, by its geography, and the country sitting on one side of that corridor, with coastline running right along it, with naval bases dotting the shoreline, with fast attack boats and anti-ship missiles and mines, is Iran. And Iran has threatened to close it, more than once. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Iran probably doesn't even want to close it. A 2012 Congressional Research Service report analyzed Iran's threats to the Strait of Hormuz and concluded that most observers believed Iran's actual intent was to shape international debate, not to physically shut the waterway down. Why? Because Iran depends on the strait too, for its own oil exports, for some of its imports. Closing Hormuz would be like setting your own house on fire to spite your neighbor. But, and this is the part the experts always gloss over, it doesn't matter whether Iran actually does it. The threat alone is a weapon. The possibility alone reprices risk. The fear alone moves markets. Because everyone knows the math, and the math is terrifying. Let's do the math. 20 million barrels per day flow through. Now how much can bypass the strait if it closes? The EIA estimates about 2.6 million barrels per day of pipeline capacity could theoretically reroute around the strait.
The IEA is a bit more generous. They say maybe 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day of available bypass capacity. But even the IEA warns that the logistics and supply chains required to reroute those flows have not been, and I'm quoting here, robustly tested.
Not robustly tested. That's a polite way of saying nobody actually knows if the backup plan works because we've never had to use it at the scale. So let's subtract 20 million flowing through minus the best case bypass of 5.5 million. That leaves roughly 14.5 million barrels per day with nowhere to go. Use the EIA's more conservative bypass number of 2.6 million, you're looking at 17.4 million barrels per day stranded. Gone from global supply. Poof. For context, the entire daily oil consumption of the United States is about 20 million barrels. So the uncovered shortfall from a Hormuz closure, it's roughly equivalent to losing America's entire oil supply. Not a dent, not a disruption, a catastrophe. And we know exactly what happens next, because it's happened before. October 19, 1973. The Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries begins a 5% production cut and launches an oil embargo following U.S. support for Israel. Oil prices start climbing. Within weeks, by November 1973, the National Bureau of Economic Research dates the U.S. business cycle peak. That's the official start of the recession. And here's what's wild. The recession was already underway before the embargo even ended. The point of no return had been crossed before anyone realized they'd crossed it. By January 1974, oil had gone from $2.90 a barrel to $11.65 a barrel, nearly quadrupled in about 3 months. The embargo was officially lifted in March 1974. Great news, right? Except the higher price level stayed. It just embedded itself into the economy like a splinter you can't reach. What followed was ugly. U.S. CPI inflation hit 6.2% in 1973, then 11% in 1974, then 9.1% in 1975. You want to know what that felt like at the grocery store? The USDA tracked the price of a 1-pound loaf of white bread, 31.5 cents in 1973. By 1974, 39.3 cents. By 1975, 41 cents. That's a 30% increase in 2 years on bread, the most basic thing you buy. And the jobs? Unemployment went from the mid-5% range in early 1974 to 9% by May 1975. 9%. So you've got prices going up, wages going nowhere, and 1 in 11 workers suddenly without a paycheck. The Bank for International Settlements has a name for this particular brand of misery. It's the inflation output stabilization dilemma. Oil shocks push inflation up while pushing economic output down. It's a trap. Central banks can fight inflation or fight unemployment, but fighting both at the same time, that's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline because the water's too cold. Meanwhile, and you're gonna love this, the stock market was doing its own impression of a building demolition. A 1975 Brookings analysis estimated that stockholder wealth losses during the 1973-74 market decline totaled $525 billion, 43% of market value, vaporized, gone, just gone. The World Bank explicitly describes the 1975 global recession as following the shock to world oil prices from the Arab oil embargo. Not a U.S. problem. A global problem. Depressed financial markets, tightening credit conditions, the whole playbook. One oil disruption, one choke point adjacent conflict, global recession. And that was the small version. Because it happened again. Of course it did. During the Iranian Revolution, Iranian oil output declined by 4.8 million barrels per day, about 7% of world production at the time, by January 1979. Oil prices more than doubled between April 1979 and April 1980. The Federal Reserve's own historical analysis notes how accommodative monetary policy allowed rising energy prices to bleed into broader, persistent inflation. The European Central Bank went even further. They argued that policy mistakes played a crucial role in the Great Inflation and explicitly rejected the idea that the 1970s could be explained by supply shocks alone. They tied it to global liquidity conditions after the collapse of Bretton Woods. The Bank of England documented that many commodity prices had already been rising sharply even before the 1973-74 oil quadrupling, and stayed high. The inflation wasn't just about oil. It was about an entire system that was fragile, over-leveraged, and one shock away from breaking. Sound familiar? Good, it should. Here's the thing nobody in charge wants to say out loud. The vulnerability hasn't gone away. It's gotten a fresh coat of paint. We've got more hedging instruments now, more flexible exchange rates, inflation targeting frameworks. Very sophisticated, very modern. Very reassuring. But the IEA still measures 20 million barrels per day through Hormuz. The EIA still measures 20 million barrels per day through Hormuz. Both agencies stress that bypass capacity is limited. The physical choke is still real, still narrow, still 29 nautical miles of ocean that could theoretically be blocked by mines, fast attack boats, or even just the credible threat of either. Now, an IMF working paper cautions that for normal oil price increases, the economic impact on importing countries is actually pretty manageable. A 25% oil price increase typically causes GDP to fall by about 0.5% or less. Not great, not a catastrophe. But a Hormuz closure isn't a normal price increase. It's a concentrated physical shock with limited bypass options and knock-on effects into gas markets and global shipping. It's the kind of event that breaks models, because the models were built for ordinary conditions. And ordinary is not what we're talking about. So what did the world do after the 1970s taught it this lesson? It built a safety net. A small one. The International Energy Agency was literally created in 1974, born directly from the trauma of the oil embargo, with an explicit mandate to coordinate collective emergency responses. They've deployed this mechanism several times: 1991 during the Gulf War, 2005 after Hurricane Katrina, 2011 during the Libyan Civil War, and twice in 2022. It's an institutional anti-weapon designed specifically to counter the leverage that choke points give to hostile actors. IEA member countries are required to hold oil stocks equivalent to at least 90 days of net imports. The U.S. side of this architecture is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, authorized capacity of 714 million barrels, connected directly to the IEA's 90-day framework through a mix of public and industry stocks. 90 days. That's our buffer against the loss of 20% of global petroleum supply. 3 months of breathing room before the math becomes unsurvivable. And here's the irony that makes this whole story a perfect Money Never Learns episode. The weapon created the shield. The 1973 embargo was so devastating that it forced the creation of the IEA, the SPR, the Emergency Coordination Protocols, the mandatory stockpiling rules. The thing that nearly broke the global economy is the same thing that built the only defenses we have against it happening again. But those defenses were designed for a partial disruption, a temporary one. A Hormuz closure, even a partial one, would burn through 90 days of reserves faster than anyone's emergency playbook accounts for, because the playbook assumes the disruption ends. And what if it doesn't end quickly? So what should you actually watch? The EIA uses Vortexa tanker tracking data, and the IEA uses Clever to monitor real-time flows through the strait. If measured throughput starts falling below that 20 million barrel baseline, that's your first signal, before prices spike, before inflation data moves, before the Fed says a word. Tanker flows are the canary in the coal mine. After that, watch the futures curve. The Federal Reserve has explained that when spot oil prices exceed far future prices, a condition called backwardation, markets are signaling scarcity. Real, physical, right-now scarcity. The CBOE OVX index, the 30-day implied volatility measure built from options on the USO oil ETF, is your fear gauge for crude. Then there's the inflation expectations bridge. The 5-year break-even inflation rate, derived from the spread between regular treasuries and inflation index treasuries, tells you when the market starts pricing an oil shock as a permanent inflation problem rather than a temporary blip. If that number starts climbing steadily, central banks have a decision to make. And as the 1970s taught us, they don't always make the right one. Finally, credit spreads. The ICE-BOFA U.S. high-yield spread over treasuries. When that widens, it means the financial system is starting to price in real recession risk, default risk, the kind of fear that freezes lending and turns an energy shock into an economic collapse. So here we are, 2025, 51 years after the world panicked, built an emergency agency, stockpiled oil, and told itself it would never be this vulnerable again. 20 million barrels per day still flow through a passage that's 4 miles wide in each direction. The backup plan covers, at best, a quarter of the volume. The logistics for rerouting haven't been tested at scale. And the country with the most leverage over the whole arrangement? It's the same country it was in 1979. The world didn't fix the vulnerability. It just got comfortable living with it. Because the strait's been open every day for decades, and humans have an extraordinary talent for confusing hasn't happened recently with can't happen. The plumbing of the global economy runs through a 54-kilometer gap between Iran and Oman. Everyone knows it. Nobody's moved the pipes. And the backup generator covers about a quarter of the building. But don't worry. The experts say the risk is manageable. The experts always say the risk is manageable, right up until it isn't. Most people will scroll past this and forget that 20% of their energy supply hangs by a geographic thread. The people in 1973 forgot too, until bread cost 30% more and 9% of them were out of work. If you'd rather see the next one coming, the subscribe button's right there. Money never learns, but maybe you can.